All right, everybody. Welcome back to another week of General Psych. Today, I want to share my screen with you and cover our next chapter on personality. Personality is one of my favorite topics because it's one of those things that makes all of us so wonderfully unique. So to dive in, let's start with a definition for our notes. So what is personality? It is the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral tendencies that people display across time and across situations. So let me break that down for you in a little bit more detail. When I'm talking about emotional, cognitive, behavioral, that's just a fancy way of saying the things that make you, you. How you think, cognitive, how you feel, emotional, what you do every day of your life. That's a reflection of who you are as a person. And I know we all go through phases and weird days and weird stretches. But to really capture something that is pervasive, that's part of your core personality, it needs to be consistent across time, across situations. It's something that you carry with you regardless of where you go. And there are a lot of different ways of thinking about personality. So the way this chapter is really broken out, we will approach it from a few different perspectives. And the first one is psychoanalytic. So the psychoanalytic approach, whenever you hear the term psychoanalytic, psychoanalysis, think Sigmund Freud. Here we go, Golden Siggy. His parents used to call him Golden Siggy. And we've talked about Freud before. I have a love-hate relationship with Freud. He drew a lot of attention to the field of psychology, so I love him for that. But he also was so off the mark on so many theories, including a few that we'll talk about today. But anyway, so it's a mixed bag when it comes to Freud. So who was Freud? Freud was a therapist. He treated neurotic disorders in Vienna in the late 1800s. So what got Freud so much popularity is he practiced a different type of therapy than other folks. He was trained by a therapist that worked on hypnosis and like putting people in this hyper suggestible state and then like letting them share aspects of themselves that they would previously keep covered. And what Freud theorized and kind of, I didn't use the term hypothesize because Freud didn't do any research whatsoever, but he did theorize. He wrote a lot of books and made some very bold claims, which other psychologists later came along and tested. But anyway, what Freud was really famous for is that the folks that would come to him for therapy would have different types of neurotic disorders. So for instance, one patient that came to Freud woke up one day and just couldn't walk. And she went to the doctor, the medical doctor, and they said, well, there's nothing physically wrong with your legs. Like those neurons are working fine. You should be able to walk. Maybe it's something mental, kind of psychosomatic. Maybe it's something in your mind. And what Freud would do is he would talk to these people who all of a sudden, out of nowhere, their body would display what later became called as a conversion disorder. And what Freud would try to do is get at the root of the problem. So what Freud thought is that this person must have experienced some sort of stress, some sort of trauma, something that was so traumatic that it was bothering this person so much, and they didn't have the like psychological resources to cope with it and deal with it. So it was leaking out. It was manifesting itself in other ways. In this case, it was causing her to be paralyzed from the waist down. Other patients would come in and they'd be blind. They could see the day before, but they woke up blind the next day. Nothing wrong with their eyes. But again, Freud would see these patients and kind of analyze their dreams, the royal path of the unconscious, when people's like kind of true unconscious attitudes and feelings would kind of bubble up and people weren't consciously guarding them to keep them down. And what Freud would do is he would process these dreams and process, hey, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Tell me about it. And dig way back deep. And what Freud realized is that during the dreams, during the kind of free association where they said the first thing that came to their mind, what the patients would realize is that some of the stresses, stem from like early childhood experiences, and they stem from like really traumatic things that they weren't capable of coping with. So once Freud was able to bring those really painful, stressful, and traumatic memories into conscious awareness, they could process them, they could put names on them, they could develop the coping resources to handle them. And the most incredible thing is the person that was paralyzed walked out of therapy. The person that was blind coming into therapy could see by the end of their therapy appointment. So Freud got a lot of praise and a lot of attention from medical doctors and psychologists across the globe, saying, who is this psychologist? What type of psychoanalytic approach, right, is Freud creating that's helping people deal with these neurotic disorders? And the part of Freud's theory, right, on psychoanalysis was that there was incredible power in the unconscious components of people's personality. That people were kind of like an iceberg. So much of who they are was below the surface, right? Was below their kind of conscious awareness of what they could be even aware of. So Freud called this a structural model, and he broke personality down into a few different components we'll talk about on the next slide. But you can think of these as being conscious, pre-conscious, or unconscious. So conscious level, think of the things that you can bring to mind right now, that you can put words to, that you can think about, that are in your kind of consciousness, your general awareness, right, above the water. And there's things that on your pre-conscious level that you aren't thinking of right now, but you could easily kind of dip down, access, and then bring them up and start thinking about it. You know, kind of like right below the water line, where you can kind of reach down and pull it up and bring it up. But the most part of who we are and the things that make us tick, Freud argued in his structural model of personality, was unconscious. So the vast majority of the iceberg that people were not even aware of, things that were manifesting itself in dreams. Early childhood experiences are so instrumental, but people may not even be aware that they're impacting who they are today. So in this structural model, you're probably wondering what's going on with the slide. On the previous, Freud broke your personality down to three parts: the ego, the superego, and the id. Ego being very conscious, superego being kind of pre-conscious, and this id being unconscious mostly. So when we talk about these three components of personality, like Freud's structural model of personality, let me define what these three terms are. The id is entirely unconscious. It's the only part of your personality Freud believed that was present at birth. And the id operates purely on the pleasure principle. So what is going to make me feel good? So it operates on sexual and aggressive drives, which is fine if you ever have been around a young child, right? The kid is hungry, so it starts screaming at you. It's too cold, it starts screaming. It's like, hey, this isn't making me pleasurable right now. Think of this baby as this bundle of id. What is going to make me feel good right now? And the kid grows up and keeps getting hungry, keeps yelling, mom, 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 I need something to eat. Is cold in the middle of the night. Dad, 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 wake me up. I need smart blankets. Constantly just like, what about me? What is going to make me feel good in this moment? What do I want to do? What toys do I want to play with? So it's very kind of like selfish in that way, very hedonistic on what are the things that are going to give me pleasure. But kids grow up. And there's no way that you would have this kid who's operating entirely as this ball of id going around the playground and saying, hey, I want to play with that toy, and just pushing another kid over, right? What you'd quickly find is, hey, that sort of behavior where we just act like what is going to give me pleasure right here in this moment doesn't work. So Freud argued that later on in life, people had to develop a counter to their id. So if the id was operating under the pleasure principle, they also developed a superego, which you can think of as their conscience. And the superego is present at both the unconscious and the pre-conscious level. And if you think of like your id on one shoulder, that little devil saying, do it, do it, do it, it's going to feel good. Think of the angel on the other side as this kind of superego saying, should we be doing things like this? Well, what did they teach you in Sunday school? what did mama always used to say about, treating people kindly? The superego operates on this ego ideal. In this ideal world, what is the right thing to do? So the superego is the kind of Ned Flanders of like, what is the moral choice? What is your conscience doing? And notice that the superego develops later on in childhood. It is present at birth, but you can't go through your entire life just operating on it. So Freud believed that you developed a superego later on to help balance the demands of your id. And the third component to your personality, which is really like the largest reflection of who you are, is your ego. And it's present at all three levels, the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious levels. And it operates on this reality principle. So if you have the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other, id and superego, you would be stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? You are thinking to yourself, man, like, do I really want to wake up and go to class this morning? Right? Your superego is saying, hey, stay up late, have a few drinks, relax, let's watch Netflix, don't worry about that, we'll sleep in, like, life will be what it is, like, enjoy it, life is short, just do whatever you want to do right now, it's going to make you feel good. And your superego is saying, nope, we should go to bed early, and we should actually set our alarm for early in the morning so we have a chance to get up early, organize our notes, do a review session, and then we'll go to class. Because that's the best thing to do to put us in the best position to succeed. Or maybe we could even set up an earlier alarm and make breakfast for other people to make sure that our friends and family are also in the best positions to succeed for their day. It's also this kind of ego ideal. It's like way too selfish, hedonistic with the id, and then way too kind of moral conscience on the other side. And people are stuck, like, what do I do here? So Freud argued that we developed a third component to our personality called the ego. And the ego operates on this reality principle, which is a fancy way of saying, okay, I know that we can't always listen to the id, and I know that we can't always listen to the superego. So how can we compromise here? Like, what's realistic? So let's say that instead of like staying up all night and blowing off class and sleeping in the morning, what if we stayed up a little bit late, maybe we watched one episode of our favorite show, and then we set our alarm tomorrow morning so we went to class on time. So we were doing a little bit of both, kind of navigating both the id and the superego. And Freud argued that the people that came into therapy that were experiencing a lot of stress and trauma and like all sorts of like repressed memories are really painful, were struggling to develop their ego to kind of deal with the demands of their id and their superego. So think of things that are challenging in life that kind of reflect who you are and how you navigate these problems. Should I be studying right now? Should I be going to church on Sunday morning? Should I put my parents in a nursing home? Should I cheat on my partner? You have all these difficult decisions, right? Where people are thinking and feeling, behaving in different ways, right? It's who they are, it's their personality. But on one shoulder, you have the id saying, no, like, let's do what makes us feel good. If your parents are annoying, ship them off to a home. If your partner isn't as attractive as that supermodel that you see, hey, let's cheat on that partner. So your id is going to get you into a whole lot of trouble if you run on it entirely. Where your superego is saying, no, like, never, we should love and respect our parents, we should love and respect our partner, we should never cheat, we could never even like ever potentially even think any impure thoughts about our parents or our partner, or not studying or not going to church. Which Freud argued, if you lean too far that direction, then you led a really repressed life, which could lead to other psychological disorders. So Freud argued that you have this ego develop as the third and final component to your personality to help you balance the competing demands of the id and the superego. Which is a pretty interesting theory, right? It sounds good. It makes for great Jeopardy trivia. It's fun to kind of simplify your personality in that regard. But unfortunately, the kind of empirical research of what personality psychologists have done today doesn't support that sort of simple idea. So anyway, Freud came up with an interesting theory, but he was wrong about that. Freud also came up with another interesting theory of how your id, ego, and superego develops throughout your early childhood. And Freud, believed that your personality developed through a series of psychosexual stages. Again, let me just preface this as this is one hell of a theory. Very interesting, very intriguing, but completely wrong. So I'll just preface it at that. Freud argued that in the first stage of a child's life, they operated in this oral stage where the id was dominant and the mouth is the focal point. So the mouth is bringing pleasure. Hey, I'm hungry. Let me get that bottle. Let me breastfeed. Let me get that pacifier. The mouth is a focal point for pleasure. Even in the first couple of years, the baby's kind of crawling around. Hey, what is this going in the mouth, right? The mouth is the focal point of pleasure in this first stage. After that, around, I believe it's age 2 or 3 or so, but anyway, don't get caught up in the specific ages. Just be familiar with the various kind of stages. The second stage is the anal stage, where kids started working on toilet training. And Freud argued that how they kind of switched the pleasure centers from like the oral stage, which is all about the mouth. Now the anal stage, the kid is really working on potty training and being very attentive to the signals of, do I have to go to the bathroom right now or not? Can I hold this? Or, can I wait? Or do I have to run and go right now? And Freud argued that the parents working with these children in this anal stage could lead them to either navigate this anal stage really easily or kind of struggle with it. Freud argued that if kids went through the stage and they were excessively concerned about hyper-cleanliness, of making sure that they're wiping perfectly and making sure that there's no more accidents and there's no more mess and nothing, no unclean surfaces anywhere, Freud would argue that these kids would develop to be anal retentive, as compared to the kids who are like, who cares? It's another mess. It's another accident. No big deal. Or, I wiped once. I needed to wipe 5 times, but who cares? Like, Freud argued that the kids who went through this anal stage with a less kind of focus on cleanliness would develop to be anal expulsive. And you hear these terms being thrown around in pop culture today when people are saying, oh, hey, don't be so anal about that. What they're referring to is Freud's second psychosexual stage of development, the anal retentive. And Freud argued that in any of these stages, kids could become fixated on it. If the parent provided too much pleasure at that stage, the kid would revert to that earlier psychosexual stage whenever they were stressed out. So like whatever made them feel good, let's say in the oral stage, Freud would argue when teenagers and adults are really stressed out, they would start smoking, right? As a way of showing this kind of oral fixation. That when they were a young kid, they used to suck their thumb, they used to suck on a pacifier, they used to breastfeed, like all those things gave them so much pleasure as a child that when they're stressed out later on in life, they will revert to these earlier stages. Earlier stages in which they were fixated on. The same reason why, Freud believed that some people would kind of chew on their pencil when they're really stressed out taking an exam, right? They were self-soothing by going back to the earlier psychosexual stage they were fixated on. So those are the first couple stages, oral stage, anal stage. Freud argued that the next psychosexual stage that kids go through is the phallic stage, in which they become aware of their own genitalia. And Freud argued that the way that, how do I say this? This is a hell of a theory. Freud argued that in this phallic stage, kids were aware of their own genitalia and they started looking at mom and looking at dad. And what Freud argued is that these little boys would develop what's called an Oedipus complex. They would look at mom and they would say things like, mom is awesome. Whenever I'm cold, mom is always there to cuddle me. Whenever I'm scared, mom is there to give me a hug. Whenever I'm hungry, mom is there to give me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are awesome, so mom is great. So Freud argued that in this phallic stage, kids were realizing just how awesome their own mother was. And they were thinking to themselves of, hey, like, I'm growing up, I need to marry mom because she makes me feel good, she keeps me warm, she keeps me fed, like all these wonderful things. Freud argued that these little boys would develop sexual, kind of romantic feelings for their mom. And along with these sexual feelings that boys would feel towards their moms, the boys would start to realize of, but mom's already taken. Mom's already married to dad. And what would dad do if he were to find out that I was sexually attracted to mom and I want him out of the picture so I could be with mom? Freud argued that they developed castration anxiety, which is that this idea that if dad were to find out that the kids were sexually attracted to the mom, that they would cut off the little boy's penis. Interesting, right? And then after the little boys went through that stage, they would go through more of a latency period of just kind of like waiting until they hit puberty. And then in this final genital stage of puberty, these little boys who had experienced this kind of Oedipus complex and castration anxiety, fearing dad was going to cut their own penis, were now thinking to themselves, you know what? I don't need to be with mom. Mom is already taken. Instead, I can be with someone just like mom. That there's other women out there that share the same positive traits. They're just as nurturing, they're just as loving, that can help provide and meet my needs in the same way that mom did. So I don't need to be with mom, but now I can be with someone just like mom. So Freud argued that in this general stage, kids moved away from this Oedipus complex into more of a kind of psychologically healthy of attraction to people who looked just like their moms and acted just like their moms. Interesting theory. Research doesn't bear it out, but it's fun to talk about. One of the criticisms of Freud's theory is it is only focused on the little boys, which was partly a function of 1890s Vienna. The sexism was rampant back in Freud's day. And anyway, Freud later developed another broader theory to help explain how little girls navigated this phallic stage. And what Freud argued is that these little girls developed an Electra complex. That when they look at dad, they said, man, dad is awesome. He's big, he's strong, he's able to provide for me and my family, and he's able to give me cuddles and keep me warm and, like, you know, provide food and like do all these really wonderful things that make me feel good and safe and secure. And then they started wondering, it was like, well, what does dad have that I don't? Well, dad has a penis. So Freud argued in this Electra complex that these little girls would develop penis envy, and that they would be later on, when they went through the latency period and then the general period, realized that, hey, they weren't growing a penis anytime soon, but there were other men similar to dad that could provide the same sort of security and love and, you know, nurturance and so on. So they became attracted to people that looked and acted like their own father. Interesting theory. And it stems from this old Oedipus Greek tragedy. I mentioned that the research doesn't bear this out very well, but every now and then you'll hear like anecdotal stories. One of them that I want to mention now is by Shia LaBeouf. Shia LaBeouf is quoted as saying, "Probably the sexiest woman I know is my mother. She's an ethereal angel. Nobody looks like that woman. If I could meet my mother and marry that woman, I would. I would be with my mother right now if she weren't my mother," as sick as that sounds. So, critiques. I'm sure a few have already come through your head already. The first one that kills me is it's not scientific whatsoever. Freud wasn't doing research himself. He was just an ideas man, writing things down in his book, drawing a lot of interest to the field. Part of the interest was other psychologists wanted to be trained in a psychoanalytic approach so they could do therapy the same way that Freud did. People like Carl Jung, Karen Horney, Anna Freud, Adler, you know, folks like that um, moved so they could train underneath Freud and learn his technique. The other thing that Freud did really well when he threw out all these theories that were not scientific at all is he pissed off enough people that were saying, you know what, like, I disagree. Like, I don't think that's how people's personality is developed. I don't think it's id, ego, and superego that's shaped by psychosexual experiences. Um, so Freud sparked a lot of research from other psychologists kind of coming along and testing it and saying, no, that's not true. So anyway, that's how the field of personality psychology really grew. Freud also based his theories on his own personal experiences and his therapeutic practice. He only saw upper class female patients in 1890s Vienna. And when you start looking at the history of Freud himself, what you realize is Freud's mother, biological mother, died during childbirth for Freud. And that strained his relationship with his father. And then when Freud was entering puberty, so just becoming a teenager, Freud's father remarried a woman who was closer in age to Freud, or to Sigmund, than to the dad. So Freud himself struggled with a lot of like attraction feelings to his stepmom. Anyway, so I mentioned that a lot of these neo-Freudians came along. So these new Freudians came along to learn from Freud, learn his perspective. And Freud was the president of the Psychoanalytic Society. So this was his baby. He was the kind of narcissistic king in this area. And his followers, his kind of proteges, would come along, and one of the most prominent ones was Carl Jung. And Carl Jung would be training him, understand the unconscious and how it worked. And then Carl Jung would kind of speak back to Freud a little bit and say, you know what, I'm believing everything that you're saying, but I also think that there's something else that you might be missing. Carl Jung argued that there was also a collective unconscious. So across cultures, across times, what you'll see is common archetypes. So like the idea of the hero that's going against all odds to save the day. And they always have that like beloved resource, that beloved friend to help them out and give them confidence when they're struggling. You see this in story after story. You see this in the Star Wars stories with Luke and Leia and Han. You see this in the Lord of the Rings stories with Frodo and Sam, right? Sam, I think that's his name. You know, like story after story of this hero kind of doing alone, but realizes that they need someone else. Carl Jung realized that like time after time, when you look at culture after culture, their stories really start to resemble kind of common characters, which you refer to as archetypes. You see the same thing with like the really warm, nurturing mother. You see the same thing with like the wise old elder, the sage leader that gives advice, right? The Yoda, the Gandalf. Oh, I'm struggling on my Lord of the Rings trivia tonight. But anyway, like time after time, you see these kind of common things kind of pop up. And Carl Jung argued that's because people were tapping into a collective unconscious. So these kind of shared archetypes that kept creeping up into people's unconscious thoughts. And this was a collective unconscious that a lot of people could tap into. So Carl Jung shared that idea with Freud, and Freud disagreed and kicked Carl Jung out of the Psychoanalytic Society. Carl Jung was going to be his protege, disagreed on this, and Freud kicked Jung out, never spoke to him. And Freud never spoke to Jung again. Other neo-Freudians came along, one of them being Alfred Adler, saying, you know what, like, I think that one thing that's missing here is how the peers compare themselves to their other peers, that kids are motivated to strive for superiority, to see who is the top dog. And if people experience this sort of inferiority complex, then that motivates them to strive even more to achieve other status symbols and superiority in other areas of their life. Again, Freud disagreed with that, kicked Alfred Adler out of the Psychoanalytic Society. And when you start looking at the story of Alfred Adler, Alfred Adler was very, very short. He had two very athletic, very tall, older brothers. Anyway, a lot of research is really stemming from kind of me search. Another neo-Freudian is Karen Horney. And Karen Horney really took offense to Freud's electric complex, arguing that little girls had penis envy for their dads, and that's what they really wanted. And Karen Horney said, you know what, the reason why people develop this, the reason why women in 1890s Vienna are developing anxiety about their gender roles is not because they wish they had a penis. What they're really envious of is privilege. They're experiencing privilege envy, especially given the sexism of that time. Karen Horney disagreed with Freud. Freud kicked her out of the Psychoanalytic Society. And these are just three neo-Freudians. Freud himself had a daughter named Anna Freud that did a lot of work in a kind of child counseling. Another neo-Freudian we've already talked about before was his name, Erik Erikson, in our developmental psych chapter. Really took offense to the psychosexual nature and said it's not sexual, Freud, it's psychosocial. And that's how Erik Erikson created the trust versus mistrust, so the kind of crises that kids experience throughout their lives. Freud didn't agree with that. So that is the psychoanalytic approach. Who am I? What makes you unique in the way you think, feel, and behave consistently across time and across situations? Freud would argue it's how you progressed through a series of psychosexual stages of how you developed how to satisfy your id, how you learned to listen to your superego, and then successfully navigate the two with your ego. Interesting theory, not a whole lot of research support. Another approach that I like a whole lot more, and a lot of counseling psychologists adhere to a lot more closely when they work with people about their personalities and the personality disorders, is called the humanistic approach. And down here in the bottom left, I have a picture of Carl Rogers, who is one of the early creators of this kind of humanistic approach. He and I share the same haircut, by the way. Carl Rogers, this humanistic approach, disagreed with Freud. Freud argued that people are inherently bad, right? When they come out of the womb, they're just these balls of id that are just, I want. I want to sleep with other people, libido. I want to destroy the world, thanatos. There's constantly, what is going to bring me pleasure? Humanistic psychologists like Carl Rogers say, no, Freud, people are not inherently bad. Humanistic psychologists argue that people are inherently good, and that their behavior is motivated by an innate drive for growth. And when you put people in the right situation, they're kind of like plants. If you put them in the right soil with the right amount of water and put them with enough sunlight, then they're going to grow. They're going to become the best version of themselves. You just need to be able to meet their kind of basic needs to allow them to grow. And what humanistic psychologists would argue is that people are motivated to achieve the self-actualized state, so the highest form of their own being. Some other humanistic psychologists you might have heard about so far, folks like Abraham Maslow, who created this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, very simplistically arguing that, you know what, you need to make sure that people first meet their physiological needs. They need to have enough air, water, food. Like, they need to make sure they have enough food to eat before they can worry about anything else in life. And as soon as they meet those sort of physiological needs, then they can worry about other needs that motivate their behavior, or how they think about the world. And one of those is safety. So do you have a home over your head? Do you have some sort of security in that regard? Do you live in a war-torn country where bombs are going off left and right? Were you born in a world after September 11th where there's terrorist attacks, and it's hard to understand, like, under what situations am I going to be safe or not? If you are worried about your own safety, where you're going to sleep that night, how you're going to maintain security throughout your life, it's hard to go to college, right? It's hard to like find the love of your life. It's hard to worry about anything else if you're worried about safety needs. So humanistic psychologists like Maslow would argue that, hey, at the bottom of this pyramid, let's first focus on these kind of physiological needs and safety needs. And then after that, then people can work on their need to belong. So these belongingness needs is the motivation to form and maintain a minimal number of close, positive relationships. So it's hard to be a good friend if you're hungry, right? And you are so worried about your own safety, your own security, and your resources and money. Like, it's hard to call up people and, worry about showing up to their birthday parties and talking to them on the phone, right? Humanistic psychologists argue that after you've met these really basic needs, physiology, safety, then you can start pursuing love and belonging, and then esteem. So holding a positive attitude toward yourself, respect, status, recognition. Again, Maslow argued that you can't even worry about like maintaining a high sense of self-esteem and status and freedom and things in life and strength if you don't have a minimal number of close positive relationships below that. And Maslow argued that the only people that ever become the fullest version of themselves that can pursue self-actualization are the ones that have consistently met all the basic needs below that. So folks like Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Mother Teresa, the ones that had secured physiological needs, safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, and then they could pursue things like creativity and giving back and developing, pouring into causes that are bigger than themselves. So the same army motto of like, be all that you can be, is a very humanistic idea. And in this humanistic approach, you had psychologists like Carl Rogers saying, well, when we focus on the self, right, your personality, who you are, let's emphasize the self-actualizing tendency. So when people go to therapy and they're saying, you know what, I'm depressed, or you know what, I don't have enough confidence, or you know what, like my self-esteem, my attitude about my own self-worth isn't as high as I would like to be. In fact, my relationships are really struggling right now. Or, you know what, like I'm so anxious and insecure, and I feel like I'm unsafe, that the world is going to come toppling down, and I'm just going to wake up tomorrow and things will be worse tomorrow than they are today. All that uncertainty. Carl Rogers would argue is like, you know what, let's put them back on this path towards self-actualization. Let's help them meet some of the basic needs that they can eventually start growing to become the best version of themselves. So it's very much development of their own kind of self-concept. Who are you? And what Carl Rogers and other humanistic psychologists really emphasized is unconditional positive regard. So the therapies, when Carl Rogers, you see him down here in this group therapy over here, would emphasize, you know what, let's develop empathy. When I'm talking to you, I want you to know that I love you and I care about you, and I'm feeling like the same thing that you're feeling. And if I'm not on the same page, give me more words, give me more experiences so I can be right there with you and feel what you're feeling. Empathy and congruence, making sure that not only am I feeling what you're feeling, but you're understanding where I'm coming from too. So we're on the same kind of congruent wavelength. And the last one is this unconditional positive regard, which sounds good in like a Katy Perry song or something like that, or in wedding vows. But what unconditional positive regard is saying, unconditionally, no conditions. There's nothing that you can say or do that is going to make me think less of you, because you are a human being, right? You were created in God's image. Like, you're a human being that has all this inherent worth because you're a human and you're inherently good. So I, during this therapy context, I'm going to model that. I'm not going to judge. I'm not going to make any faces when you open up about things that you're embarrassed about. No, unconditional positive regard. I'm loving you for who you are. And what Carl Rogers and other humanistic psychologists would practice is, what would that therapy session look like? Imagine, right, going to that sort of therapy session and realizing, you know what, I feel really good by the end of this, right? I'm opening up, and you have someone who's attentive, that's leaning forward and saying, oh yeah, it sounds like you're a little angry. Is that right? Well, I'm not angry per se, I'm more frustrated. Okay, so it sounds like you're frustrated at this. Are we on the same page, right? Are we congruent here? Am I feeling what you're feeling correctly, right? Am I showing empathy? And the whole time, this person's not judging you. They're saying, you know what, you are inherently valuable because you're a human being. Unconditional positive regard. And what these people would leave therapy saying is like, I love this interaction. I wish all of my relationships were this way, but they're not. They might go home to an abusive spouse, or they might go home and talk to their parents that aren't treating them with love and respect. In fact, they might go home to a parent that says, hey, if you don't get into Harvard, I'm not loving you, right? I'm not telling you that you're doing a good job in life, because they start setting up all these conditions of worth, which is the exact opposite of what the humanistic psychologist is saying, showing, right? Modeling unconditional positive regard. So the idea is, hey, if you just put them in this ideal situation, they'll start realizing that if they start distancing themselves from these less healthy relationships and start putting themselves in other relationships that are characteristic of empathy, congruence, unconditional positive regard, then they'll just naturally grow. They'll naturally start becoming the best versions of themselves in this self-actualized way. And unlike Freud, Carl Rogers loved data, loved evidence, loved running the studies, and humanistic psychology approaches work. Humanistic therapy is effective, and I'll talk a whole lot more about it in a couple of chapters where we talk all about various treatment for psychological disorders. But humanistic therapy works, and what Carl Rogers and humanistic psychologists would argue about: who are you? What is your personality, right? This tendency to think, feel, and behave in consistent ways across time, across situations, is shaped by the people around you. It's shaped by the conditions of worth that other people are putting on you and that you're putting on yourself. And if only you were to be put in a healthier relationship, if only you were able to be put in a position where you met some of those basic needs of food, shelter, belongingness, esteem, then you would start developing into the highest form of yourself. The most creative, the most hopeful, the most loving and awe-inspiring, and all those other wonderful positive traits out there. Very different so far, right? So we have Freud, people are inherently negative. We have Carl Rogers and humanistic psychologists that are saying people are inherently good and they will only become better if you put them in positive environments that allow them to thrive. And there's other personality psychologists out there saying, you know what, we're kind of looking at it the wrong way. What we're trying to do is add theoretical ways of like explaining how people got this way. Let's not do that. Let's just describe where they are right now. And these trait theorists came along and said, you know what, let's start boiling personality into specific traits and just look at what are the traits that are predicting behavior. So what I'd like for you to do is either grab a pen or paper or your notes or something like that, and answer these questions about yourself. I'll share a few statements, and just real quick, first thing comes to your mind, on a 1 to 5 scale, how much do you agree with each one of these statements? Does this sound like you? I see myself as someone who's open to trying new things, a complex person. So does that sound like you on a 1 to 5 scale? Number 2, I see myself as someone who is dependable, self-disciplined. Does that sound like you? I see myself as someone who's extroverted, enthusiastic. To what extent does that sound like you? 4, I see myself as someone who is sympathetic, warm. Does that sound like your personality? And 5, I see myself as someone who is calm, emotionally stable. Does that sound like you? And what trait psychologists realized is there were a whole lot of different traits out there. I'll come back to your scores in 1 second. But these early personality psychologists that were focusing on people's personality traits, they realized there were a lot of different traits out there. The first thing that they did is they went through the dictionary and they just looked at how many different words are in the dictionary to describe people's personality. And they found that there was more than 4,000 different personality traits. A ton. And there's no way you could use like a 4,000 item scale to measure like who are you as a person. And in fact, when you start looking at some of the personality traits of I'm extroverted, gregarious, sociable, affable, fun-loving, sociable, like we start breaking it down, it's like, you know what? That kind of sounds like someone who like enjoys parties, that gets along well with other people, that gets their energy, from talking and being around other people, kind of fun-loving. And what they realized is a lot of those different traits tended to kind of cluster together. And they used a fancy statistical test referred to as factor analysis to say, hey, if we start out with 4,000 different traits, some people are going to start agreeing with a few different traits that are similar to each other, and other people are going to start agreeing with other traits that are really similar to each other. What if we started boiling all that down? What is the minimal number of traits out there that best describe who people are? And there's a few different camps, but the model that has received the most theoretical and empirical support is this 5-factor model of personality. They often refer to this as the Big Five, right? So the Big Five, the 5-factor model of personality, argued that when you really want to describe who someone is, they think, feel, and behave across time, across situations, the 5 traits that you should lean in on are openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which means emotional stability. And if you're wondering why in the world there's a wave, like a beach wave on the picture over here, pause, think about it for a second. My tip and trick to help remember the Big Five is ocean, right? See the way I think of ocean, OCEAN. Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Ocean, for short. And those 5 questions that you just answered dictated, right, told me what your scores are on the Big Five. So let me describe each one of those in a lot more detail. The first one is openness. So openness to experience is someone who is curious about learning new things. People who go to college score higher in openness to experience. The people who look at the college catalog and are like, oh, that sounds cool, let me take that, and this, and that, and they're all over the place. People who are open to experience, you look at their music selection, you look at their Spotify playlist, and you're like, you went from like Lil Wayne to this podcast, to classical music, to country, like you're all over the place, right? Open to a lot of different experiences. They tend to read more broadly. They're a lot more open to Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and like kind of fantastical ideas. They're more open to different feelings, to different realities, to different ways of kind of seeing and understanding the world, right? Openness in general to a lot more perspectives. What's so cool about personality traits is when personality traits are so strong within an individual, right? They're the way they think, feel, and act across time, across situations. These personality traits will leave in their wake behavioral residue. So if someone is high in openness to experience, they make different decisions in their life. That if you know what you're looking for, you can look at someone's dorm room, you can look at their office, right? You can look at their apartment and accurately infer their personality traits, just looking at the behavioral residue that's left in their wake, which is a fancy way of saying like, yes, you can profile people. In fact, these personality psychologists can work for the FBI and CIA and things like that. So what you could do is look at someone who's openness to experience and look at the pictures. Are they traveling abroad, right? There's some people who scored really high on openness to experience. And they're like, yeah, like last summer I went to Thailand, and the year before that I went to Mexico, and the year before that I went to Sweden. It's like, you're all over the place, just trying different cultures on for size. And other folks like, no, like on my vacation, I wanted to go to the beach. and we always go to the beach. Like, that's what we do. There's some folks that when you ask them, hey, like, what sounds good for dinner? And they're like, let's go to Applebee's. And I always get the cheeseburger and french fries. And like, you never really change from that. Those folks are very, are most likely to score really low in openness to experience. Whereas the folks kind of like, let's try, escargot, let's try like, Thai food and Indian food and Mexican food, and let's try like, and you're bouncing all around, trying the most obscure things on the menu just because, just to feel like you've tried it. That tendency, that value of like, I want to open myself up to new experience is one of the big 5 personality traits that does a really good job of distinguishing people. The second big 5 personality trait is conscientiousness, which is a fancy way of saying how kind of detailed and organized and efficient are you with your time. So people who score really high in conscientiousness are the folks that, like, when they were kids in elementary school, you open their backpacks, and those are the kids that had like the big binders, and they had a folder for this and a folder for that and another folder for that. And you look at their notes, and it's like the notes for this class are in this color, and the notes for that class are in another color. And if something is like a key term, I highlight in yellow. If it's a definition, I highlight in red or something. Like those folks, it's like you are hyper organized. Those folks would score high in conscientiousness. Where other folks, it's like just throw paper in your backpack and that's it. Right? Don't have that same sort of kind of structure to their life. That's incompetence, order, kind of dutifulness. There's some people where when you say, all right, like, let's go on vacation. They're like, cool, let's just wing it. We'll show up at the airport, we'll grab a ticket, we'll, figure it out as we go. And other people, that scares them to death. They're like, no. Here's our itinerary. I planned it out. Here's the distance from our hotel to the airport. Here are the different activities. They're rank ordered from like most popular to least popular given TripAdvisory. And they're saying, all right, like, given all the kind of restaurants out there, this one's the closest to it. This one's also close to this beach we wanted to go to. Those folks that are hyper organized, those are the ones that you want planning your vacations, planning your weddings, planning your business meetings, like the folks that really enjoy Google Calendars and have everything really, really kind of down to an art. You can also look at someone's living space and accurately infer their conscientiousness. You can look like a profiler would if you look at people's dorm rooms. The person on the left, very organized, very efficient. They might have like their phone and then a notepad in case someone calls them and they need to make a quick note or something like that. Everything is very efficiently kind of laid out. Everything's organized. Everything has a drawer, like very efficient and conscientious. Whereas the person on the right, it's like, where is everything? What's going on? Right? There's no kind of structure going on there at all. And it probably doesn't bother the person on the right, right? That person is likely very low in conscientiousness. If you ever swing by faculty office hours, every faculty office does not look the same, right? There's some faculty offices, kind of like mine, where like you walk in and like everything is very laid out. Like you can like see the floor, you can see the desk, you can see like these books go over here for this class, these books go over there for that class. There's a filing structure, everything's very kind of clean, organized, very efficient. And there's other faculty's offices that you look in and it's just like stack after stack after stack of paper. You're like, what course is that for? Oh, I don't know, maybe last semester, I don't know. And just like a lot less organized, a lot less kind of efficient and clean in their times. I'm sure you'll also notice that as well when certain faculty members give instructions for assignments. Some are very kind of conscientious, very efficient and organized. Whereas others, not so much. But this is an interesting skill set. So when you're thinking about who to date, you're most likely to hit off with people whose personality traits are similar to your own. What you can do is ask some questions on the first date and start picking up on some of these big 5 personality traits. And one of them that's worth checking out is conscientiousness. And if you check out their dorm room or check out their office, you can accurately infer their personality trait if you know what to look for. Yeah, the folks who have like their spice rack organized either alphabetically or organized ranging from like most commonly used to least commonly used for most efficient. Anyway, I'm not going to reveal too much more about my personality. The third trait in the big five is extraversion. So think of introversion, extroversion being a continuum. In fact, I should have mentioned that for all of these big five, they have a normal distribution, which meaning some people score really low, some people score really high. Most people score around the middle. So if you look at that kind of bell curve, most people are in the middle for all of these traits. There's fewer people that are really extreme high, really extreme low. And in fact, on your scores, on those 5 questions, that quick activity, few ones, few fives, most people are in the kind of 3 ranges. So yeah, I can see that being somewhat true of me. Extroversion is really referring to where are you getting your energy from? Do you, at the end of a long work week where you're exhausted, you've had a lot of tasks, a lot of tasks, a lot of tasks, a lot of assignments, people have asked a lot of you, a lot of presentations, and you are worn down by the end of this week. What recharges your battery, right? What gives you energy? And there are some people that say, let me invite my friends over, let me go out to that party, let's get out on the town. Being around other people is going to rev my engine back up. Other people are like, no, thank you. I want to be, hanging out by myself, some alone time. Let's watch some Netflix. Let's just chill out and hang out, right? That sort of variability on like where you're getting your energy from is extroversion versus introversion. The extrovert is a lot more sociable, a lot more warm, talkative, assertive. A lot of the characteristics of leaders fit more of this extroversion. More excitement-seeking activities, experience a lot more kind of positive emotions than the introverts that tend to be a little bit more quiet, reserved, and self-reflective. And introversion, extroversion both have behavioral residue. So if you want to profile someone, what you can do is look at their living space, look at their dorm room, look at their office. There are some people's homes where you walk in and there's a ton of seating. There's a lot of seating and it's really comfortable. The colors on the wall are really attractive, like really colorful to draw people in. There's a lot of places for them to sit and stay that's comfortable, that they can carry on conversations for longer periods of time, because the extrovert wants to draw people in and have these conversations for longer periods of time. Whereas the introvert may just have one chair that's really comfortable, and that's for them. They might have one other chair in there for a guest, but it's not going to be that comfortable because they don't really want to draw on a bunch of people. They really don't want to make it stay. So like the same, like open concept kitchens and like, let's have it so I can see everybody. We can throw a big party and I can talk to a bunch of people at the same time. Really speaks to that sort of extroversion. Whereas the introverts are like, no, I'm good. Like, let me get one really comfortable spot for me. Faculty members are the exact same way. If you swing by a certain faculty member's office, you'll walk in there and there might be a couch and there might be a couple chairs that are really comfortable because they want you to come in, they want you to sit, and they want you to stay for a while and talk to you, right? Because they're extroverts by nature. My office is definitely that way. There are other faculty members that are a little bit more introverted that are saying that might just have like one cold metal chair. And it's like, well, that's my office hour chair. Like if a student happens to come in for office hours, they have one place to sit, but it's not warm, it's not inviting, it's not comfortable. They don't want you to come in and stay for long periods of time. That's the sort of introversion extroversion spectrum. The fourth trait of the big five is agreeableness. So think of agreeableness as this kind of like social harmony. When you're talking to some people are just really easy to get along with. They aren't going to be like, pause you, say, you know what, I disagree with that, or they aren't going to get in your face and start debating you and say, you know what, here are all the reasons why you're wrong. Let's have a quick debate and go, tit for tat on that. Those folks that are like confrontational in your face, making very vocal that they disagree with you, are disagreeable people, right? They would score low on this agreeableness trait. Other folks that are a lot more warm, that like you can say anything to, and there's kind of like nodding along, like, yeah, I see it. Even if they might personally disagree, they aren't going to bring that to your face, right? A lot more trusting, a lot more altruistic and compliant, modest, tender-minded. Think of these as more like socially harmonious people. And I know you've probably experienced this before when you were asking your friends, hey, where do you want to go for dinner? Your friends that score really high in agreeableness are like, wherever you want to go is fine. Whatever, I don't care. And you're like, no, seriously, like what sounds good? Whatever, no big deal. That's that agreeableness. The other folks, they're saying like, it's Tuesday and it's tacos and we always have tacos on Tuesday. Like that's, you're a little bit more disagreeable. It's kind of rigid, kind of black and white, probably going to be more kind of in your face. It's the difference between the folks that you would see on the news, kind of talking about politics, kind of the rival parties with really strong beliefs, the Rachel Maddows and the Sean Hannitys, the Tucker Carlsons and the Brian Williams and folks like that, right? A little bit more conservative, like in your face, Lawrence O'Donnell, right? There it comes to mind. Telling you like why I think you're wrong, and it's because of X, Y, and Z. And they're very like confrontational, right? Those folks are going to score really low in agreeableness. But folks like Mr. Rogers and folks like Grandma Sugar, who's just like so sweet to everybody, they call her Sugar. Like those folks are going to be really high in agreeableness. And the last trait of the big five, right? This kind of trait theory is neuroticism. And neuroticism is just a fancy word for emotional stability. So if people are really low in emotional stability, they tend to experience a lot of mood swings. It might be really happy and really sad and really depressed and really anxious. Emotional instability is referred to as neuroticism. So people who score high in neuroticism are going to experience a lot more anger, be a lot more self-conscious and impulsive, and not surprisingly vulnerable to stress as well. Think of Piglet, right? The sky is falling. What are we going to do, Pooh? Like constantly freaking out. Would be someone who's highly neurotic versus someone who is like super cool, like unfazed, like the Fonz, or Barney from How I Met Your Mother. Someone like, hey, whatever happens, no big deal. I'm just cool. I'm going to roll with it. Nothing phases me. Very emotionally stable, very emotionally unstable. So highly neurotic, low in neuroticism. And what you find, not surprisingly, is that there is a genetic component to these trait models as well. So not only do people with similar personality traits tend to date and marry and have their relationships last because similarity breeds liking, but you also find that they pass on their personality traits genetically to their children as well. So it's common for kids to have the same genetic personality traits as their parents. You even complicate that even further because not only are the parents genetically kind of passing down through their heritability their traits to their kids, but they're also shaping their social world. The same way, if I'm really extroverted and my wife is really extroverted, not only do we pass along those extroverted traits to our child through their genes, but we also have a house that's like really set up for parties, and we frequently invite people over and have dinner parties, and like put our kids in situations where they're going to interact with other people and encourage them to go have conversations and ask people how their day is and invite them over and things like that. So it's nature and nurture. Don't forget both. In fact, it's largely an interaction between the two. And as the kids get older, they take their genetic predispositions and they start seeking out environments that are going to strengthen and reinforce those personality traits as well. So there are other trait models as well. The big five is just the one that's received the most attention. There's other models like the Hexaco model that argues that there's a sixth trait out there, like honesty, humility, that they think is missing in the big five. There's other psychologists like Allport, Cattell that think that there's 16 traits out there. The big five has received the most research attention. But there's other personality psychologists that focus more on really specific sub-traits. One of them I want to give you guys a quick activity is pause the video right now and answer these 12 questions about yourself. And then after I'm done, I'll tell you what these traits are measuring. So pause the video, complete this task. And when you're done, I want you to add up your score on the first 4 items, total, and then total your score on items 5, 6, 7, and 8, total that up. And then for the last 4 items, 9, 10, 11, 12, add those up. And what you'll have is 3 different numbers that are your score on what's referred to as the dark triad. So there are 3 dark or antisocial, kind of a socially aversive personality traits that tend to cluster together within people. They are theoretically distinct, but they tend to co-occur in the same people. And the first trait I want to tell you about is Machiavellianism. So that number, that was your total for the first 4 items. People who score high in Machiavellianism are very manipulative, deceitful. They kind of lie and extort, deceive, manipulate people to satisfy their own needs. So think of Tony Soprano from The Sopranos, or think of any character like the Underwoods from House of Cards, right? How can I like use you? How can I plant this seed, or how can I get you to do something when it's really going to benefit me in return? So people who score high in Machiavellianism may have friends, but they kind of exploit their friends. They, in fact, people who score high in Machiavellianism will like post things on Facebook. Well, back in the day, right? Used to post things on Facebook when it was popular as a way of like manipulating their friends to do things for them. That if they weren't doing what they want to, then they would like get secrets and details about them and start leaking them out, right? As a way of like manipulating other people. Women who fake orgasms, for instance, tend to score high in Machiavellianism, a way of kind of like manipulating their partner into believing something that wasn't true. Just a very kind of like deceptive way of like, how can I benefit from this by manipulating someone else? So it's a dark trait. The second trait in this the dark triad is psychopathy. And we'll talk more about psychopathy as a psychological disorder next week in our psychological disorders chapter. When you hear psychopathy as part of the dark triad, this is subclinical. So like everyday levels of psychopathy. Psychopathy is a tendency to show a lack of remorse, lack of perspective taking, very kind of impulsive, living a fast lifestyle. So the people that will, you know, steal $5 from you, but like, I don't care. You know, they'll say like a funny joke because it makes them feel good or make people laugh like in the moment, but like, you know, they're not thinking about your perspective. They're not, you know, feeling any sort of remorse for that after the fact. Some personality and clinical psychologists argue that about 1% of the population reaches this kind of like subclinical level of psychopathy. The folks that make really great CEOs, that can make really difficult decisions of like who to fire and not lose any sleep that night. In fact, with like the Enron scandals back in the day, you would have CEOs fire thousands of employees, steal their pensions, and then fly off on the weekend on their own private helicopter to their own private yacht and their golden parachute money from their failing businesses and sleep just fine. It's like, that's a lack of empathy, lack of perspective taking. That's what this kind of subclinical psychopathy is referring to. The third trait is narcissism. So narcissism is also a psychological disorder, but for here, we're talking about subclinical narcissism. So subclinical, like everyday levels. This is your folks that have like these like grandiose, over-the-top beliefs in themselves. It's sometimes referred to as a hollow sense of self, that they need praise and admiration and adulation of the world around them to constantly build themselves up. They need the attention. They need other people telling how great they are and appreciate them, because if they don't get that sort of praise from other people, then they're hollow on the inside, like this kind of hollow, shallow sense of self that they need to be constantly kind of uplifted. What's scary about narcissists is they are especially reactive to threats to their self-image. So when you threaten a narcissist by social rejection, right, not inviting them to a party, or unrequited love, say, like, the narcissist said, hey, do you want to go out on a date? You say, hell no, I'd never go out with you. I don't like you at all. Like, that would be very self-threatening. Narcissists, you have to worry about because they tend to deal with threats in a really aggressive way. A really terrible case study of this was the Columbine shooters, where you try and understand why in the world would people commit this school shooting and kill their classmates. After the fact, you had psychologists go in and read their diaries, their kind of video diaries, their vlogs, they call them, and interview their friends and interview their teachers and talk to their parents. And in these statements and in their diaries, you start hearing these narcissistic claims that, like, after this, we're going to get the attention that we've always deserved. And I can make anyone believe anything about me, that I have a twin growing out of my back. This sort of grandiose ideas about themselves. What's really dark is in their video diaries, they would make comments like, after this is over, Spielberg and Quentin Tarantino are going to be fighting over rights to this screenplay because they're going to make a movie about us. That sort of idea, that's like narcissism. And then what happens when you have day after day about being bullied and rejected and social isolation and exclusion and unrequited love, all those threatened need to belong, right, are so characteristic of the Columbine shooters, a lot of other narcissists, and it's not surprising that they dealt with that threat to their self-concept in a really aggressive way. So those are three really dark traits. They also tend to co-occur in the same people. Although Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy are theoretically distinct, what they show is most people who score high in one tend to score high in all three. That's why they refer to it as the dark triad. I don't think your book covers a whole lot about the dark triad, so this is something that is really unique to our notes in class, and more of the field of personality psychology now. In this dark triad, most of these traits have been really negative, like you wouldn't necessarily want to score high in them. A notable exception would be someone like James Bond. James Bond is high in all three of those dark triad traits. But people like James Bond. He's very narcissistic, right? He's James Bond. He thinks he can save himself. He can do it. It's God's gift. That I need, God one, like how will it benefit me? And the last one, psychopathy. Lack of remorse, lack of perspective taking. I'm gonna sleep with whoever I want. I'm gonna kill whoever I want. And it's not gonna bother me at all. Someone like James Bond would score high in the dark triad. But it's interesting that people really like James Bond. So that's a few different perspectives, right? We've talked about psychoanalytic with Freud, humanistic, Carl Rogers, and we've talked about the kind of trait theory, the Big Five, and other models out there. The last thing I want to talk about today is how do you assess personality? And there's a few different ways, right? If you're trying to capture how does someone think, feel, and behave across time and across situations, either you can follow them for an extended period of time and keep asking them over and over and over again. But the problem is that people lie, right? People can misrepresent themselves. They want to see themselves in a certain light, so they might lie to you or might inaccurately report about themselves. So if you want to get away from that, what you can do is either observe them yourself or ask a friend or family members of them to report, hey, how extroverted or how agreeable do you think this person is? Because what you often find is that close friends and family members are better. Their estimates of the personality tend to better predict their behavior than people themselves. partly because we have these positive self-illusions. We like to think that we're a little bit better than we actually are. In fact, on a side note, side tangent, um, counseling psychologists often argue that um, uh, people that are clinically depressed actually have accurate views of themselves. And it's this, these like positive illusions, this unrealistic optimism, this um, um, self-serving biases that people have. They think that they're better than they are is a nice way of most people to maintain and bolster a positive self-image. So anyway, you can ask people themselves, that's referred to as self-report, or ask their friends and family members, or bring in an interviewer and things like that would be an observer rating. When you look at self-reports, what you can do is just ask people via open-ended questions, tell me about yourself, via an interview. Challenges with that is their answers are going to be all over the place. And then you have to be very careful in how you code their responses in a way that your own biases and your own beliefs don't creep in there, and you're really measuring as valid and reliable as possible what this person's personality is. So another way to get around from that would be like a questionnaire, which is what I gave you before to measure the dark triad and the big five. Here are some statements. How characteristic do you think these are of you? And in fact, you might have these personality psychologists working with colleges and dating apps to like capture people's personalities. You often see the same sort of personality assessments in forensic psychology in the court of law, where they're trying to say like, hey, like, are you a clinical psychopath? Like, what is your personality like? Or the person that you're living with that was charged with this crime, how agreeable were they? You know, what dark traits do they have? Things like that. But you can also find some really creative ways of measuring personality, like if people struggle with language or they're really hesitant to open up, what you can do is ask them to draw a picture in a really projective way, where if you say, hey, draw a picture of you, what you can do is look at how they draw this picture, and given whether they put a smiley face on themselves or a frowny face, or whether they draw themselves really big or really small, what psychologists have learned over time is that these choices might seem innocent enough, they might seem innocuous, that they're just kind of leaking out there, but they're really projecting something true about the individual and how they view themselves. In fact, you often see this with child psychologists when they're trying to counsel children. They might say, hey, draw a picture of you in the rain. And they're looking and saying, all right, like, are these clouds, for instance? Notice how they're big, but they're not huge. And they're white, they aren't black or gray or really kind of dark. They're raining, actually raining kind of a lot. They're landing right on this person, on their head, but notice that the person's still smiling. And the person has an umbrella. So they have, what a counseling psychologist would argue, is they see themselves as having some resources that are protecting themselves. They aren't protecting themselves all of the way, but that doesn't seem to be bothering this person. There's other folks, when they say, hey, draw yourself in the rain, they have frowny faces, they have really serious weather, the raindrops are really big and really heavy and really dark. They might not have any sort of covering for themselves, or the worst picture I've seen was like an umbrella that just had the spokes, and that, you know, it didn't have any covering. It was just like a skeleton kind of outline of what the umbrella was, and all the water was getting back through on the person. It's like, that's telling you so much about how this person views themselves and their situation. You often see child psychologists do personality assessments on the family as well. Say, hey, draw a picture of your family in front of your house. And they look at the house and they say, are there windows in the house? How big is the house? Where are the people in relation to the house? Did they draw all of the people in the family? Where did they put mom? Where did they put dad? Where did they put the kid? Are they holding hands? Is dad off by himself somewhere? Are mom and the kid smiling and dad frowning? Like all that stuff psychologists have used in really creative ways to, to look at family dynamics, but also personality traits as well. Anyway, there's whole courses on this stuff. In psych, you're more than welcome to explore this stuff. A couple of these projective tests I want to talk about specifically, even though I just went on a huge tangent there about draw a person. The first projective test that you might have heard of before is the Rorschach test. It's an ink blot that you would have these kind of standardized cards, and you would show them to participants and say, hey, there's no right or wrong answers, but just tell me the first few things that come to mind. And if you look at pictures like this, right, some things are going to come to mind. I wish we were all together, because this is where it gets really, really interesting when you kind of open it up. For you, some people might see a butterfly, right? That's showing this kind of lightheartedness, like positive things are going on. Other people might see like a really dark detective with like smoke coming off around him. It's like, interesting, right? There's a lot of different things that you could have seen there. Is it telling anything meaningful about you that you saw a detective with dark smoke, like hiding his identity, right? That is telling me that, hey, you might have this, something you feel like you might want to hide. So in these projective tests, they'll show picture after picture and say, what are some things that you see here? And other people might say, well, I see two people practicing yoga and meditation, right? Revealing something about themselves, about a calmness. Other people might start seeing a couple of people kind of looking back and forth at each other. Other people might see a butterfly. Other people might see people dancing. Like all those things are revealing something about how you view an ambiguous stimuli. And the rationale behind the projective test is that you would you project your own personality, your own thoughts and beliefs and values onto an ambiguous stimuli. So here are some other cool ones. I'm tempted to just like tell you the things that I see, but anyway, I don't want you judging me. We'll save that for Wednesday's lecture review. I'm really curious to see what sort of things you guys come up with. And again, there's no right or wrong answers to these projective images. The things that psychologists and personality psychologists would be looking for in these projective tests are what are some major themes that are coming across? Are they coming across with really common things like, oh, I see bubbles? Or are they coming up with like really random things like, I see a menu at a taco shop where a person had too much salsa and they spilled a bunch of salsa while they're eating their taco or something. Interesting, right? Might reflect more of an openness to experience. More elaborate they get. So Rorschach is a classic projective test via ink blots. Another type of projective test is the thematic apperception test, the TAT, the TAT, thematic apperception test. And in the thematic apperception test, you would show an image like this. You would ask people, what's going on? Who's that guy? Who's the girl? What's happening right now? What happened right before this? And what's going to happen next? And this is purposely ambiguous, right? There's a lot of different ways of interpreting this scenario, but the idea of a projective test is the story that you come up with is going to reveal something about your personality. So I've given this same projective test to a lot of college students before, and some of the things that they come up with are like, well, that person just murdered that woman, and they're feeling so ashamed that they murdered this human being that is covering his eyes. Maybe could have murdered her. Or maybe this person cheated on his wife and this person's married, can't really see the ring or anything like that, but maybe the guy is married and he's had an affair with this woman and he's like regretting that he was doing so. Maybe. Or maybe this person is teaching like a really early class, for instance, and then has to go to work really, really early and really dislikes having to get up early, and it's really tough for him. That's why he's like wiping the sleep out of his eyes, and he's jealous that his wife gets to sleep in. Maybe, right? Like there's no right or wrong answer here, but notice the answers that people come up with start revealing something about themselves. Like, have you thought about cheating on your partner? Are you jealous that you have to work really hard early in the morning and other people around you not so much? Right, things like that. Or maybe the woman lying down there died of some disease recently, and the person's really, really sad that there's not more that they could do. Okay, are you dealing with some sort of grief and loss? Are you dealing with some sort of pain in that way? So this is what the thematic apperception test kind of looks like. Just picture after picture, it's ambiguous, and they ask people to give the backstory themselves. In fact, a really funny one, I think it was last year or so, I showed students the same picture. I said, who is this? And a common response is, oh, this is, a college student in a chemistry class, and they're like pipetting some chemical reaction or something like that. That's a really standard one. This one student's hand shot right up in the back and said, that's me and that's my mom, and like she's watching me and there's nothing I can ever do that's good enough for her. And it's like, whoa. Like, okay, like maybe you're projecting some of your own anger, mom issues, like onto this ambiguous scenario, maybe. Here are some other ones. So yeah, on Wednesday, I'm really curious to see what sort of responses you guys are coming up with. So, so far we've talked about psychoanalytic, humanistic, trait theories, which really rest on like assessing personality in really meaningful ways. And the last slide I want to touch on real quick isn't saying that people are inherently good, like humanistic. It's not saying that people are inherently bad, like psychoanalytic. It's not even saying like they're just, traits, let's just measure them like the trait theorists. The final approach I want to talk about is this kind of learning and cognitive approach, which argue that people are blank slates, that people are whoever you create them to be. So personality psychologists that are leaning more towards this kind of learning cognitive perspective would be folks like, what's his name? John Watson from the Watson and Rayner Little Albert study. In fact, this is a quote from John Watson up here that I just really, really love. It says, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. A doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a merchant chief, and yes, even a beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." Watson is arguing, this learning psychologist, arguing that people are blank slates. You can turn them into whatever you want them to be by classical conditioning, by operant conditioning, by changing how the world is operating on them. In fact, you had people like B.F. Skinner, who was that psychologist that worked with the rats and the pigeons to look at schedules of reinforcement, right, that we talked about a few chapters ago. Someone like B.F. Skinner created that same sort of Skinner box for his rats and pigeons to see what happens if you drop a pellet when they, click on the box once or every 2 times or every minute or so. And in fact, what he did is also create a kind of Skinner box for his own kid and tried to market it, and it didn't go well, unsurprisingly. So like ways of like changing this kid's behavior by like, if you want them to be more vocal, for instance, whenever they kind of cry out, then you like give them a treat. Or if they're moving around a lot, then you cool the temperature or you warm the temperature up, or you put in food or things like that. Like you change our environment in a way that operates on their behavior to either reinforce it or punish it. That was a little rough, but what B.F. Skinner also did is he wrote the book Walden 2, which for those of you that haven't heard of it, Walden 2 is this utopian society of how we could change society. We could take away crime if we wanted to by changing how the rewards and punishments worked. if we wanted people to be a lot more helpful and conscientious and a lot more egalitarian, like we could change society. We could change the way stoplights worked. We could change the way our reward structures worked and our tax incentives work. You could just change people's personality by changing how their world was operating on them to reinforce behaviors or punish behaviors, which is a pretty extreme belief. So as a parent, you would like to think that you can give your child experiences and rewards and punishments that shape their behaviors and sense of self and personality, for lack of a better term. And there's certainly some truth to that. In fact, if we were to ask people like what made them who they are today, they often talk about these, you know, early experiences about growing up in a different country, or, you know, growing up in a household with a lot of kids, very few kids, or playing sports and being rewarded for being competitive and things like that. So there certainly is truth to this kind of learning and cognition approach, but it's just one way of thinking about personality. So yeah, there certainly is that sort of operant conditioning, rewards and punishments. There's also social learning as well, which we talked about the last slide of our learning chapter a few weeks ago, that even if you aren't rewarding and punishing behaviors, kids aren't dumb. Kids are watching their siblings, or watching TV, they're watching other people, and they're seeing what works for them. They're seeing on the Disney Channel who gets the girl, who scores the winning touchdown, what do they talk like, what do they act like, how are they treating other people. And when they realize that this is working for other people, via social learning, they're going to start modeling their own behavior after that. So as the last slide, I really want this to be a kind of take home. And when you start thinking about who you are and who you want to be careful of the people that careful of the situations you're putting yourself in. Be careful of the models that you're exposing yourself to. For better or for worse, those are the people that you are going to become over time. All right, so that's it for our personality psychology chapter. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, I will see you on Wednesday for the lecture review. All right, take care, everybody.